The trade standoff between the US and Canada reached new heights recently, highlighting the deepening economic chasm caused by President Donald Trump's aggressive tariff policies. What was initially designed as a means to protect American jobs has morphed into a series of unpredictable, sometimes chaotic moves that are now affecting industries far beyond the intended targets. With steel, aluminum and auto parts at the heart of this escalating trade war, the second quarter of 2025 marked a critical turning point. General Motors, GM, reported a staggering $1.1 billion loss, directly tied to the tariffs that have driven up steel prices by as much as 30%. The tariffs, initially positioned as a weapon to shield American manufacturers from unfair foreign competition, have instead placed a heavy burden on U.S. companies, particularly in the auto sector. The higher costs for materials like steel and aluminum are now causing ripple effects throughout the economy, pushing up the price of cars and squeezing manufacturers' margins. The escalation is particularly visible in the relationship with Canada, which has faced tariffs as high as 50% on steel and aluminum, and 25% on auto parts. President Trump's strategy, aimed at securing better trade deals for the U.S., has instead forced Canada to rethink its approach to industrial production. Rather than meekly requesting exemptions, Canada has fought back by retooling its industrial capacity. Premier Doug Ford of Ontario led the charge, announcing support for revitalizing the domestic steel industry, including reindustrializing sectors from aluminum cans to I-beams and rebar. The Canadian government, under Prime Minister Mark Carney, followed suit with subsidies, red tape reductions, and fast-tracked approvals for new industrial investments. This marked a shift from survival mode to a more strategic approach. By redirecting its steel production to domestic auto manufacturing and expanding exports to Asia and Europe, Canada has made a decisive move that bypasses the United States entirely. The results are already evident. Canada's industrial resilience has been bolstered, and a national push is underway to reduce reliance on U.S. steel. While this may be seen as a policy response, it is also a sign of a larger economic transformation that is reshaping the broader North American auto market. This shift, however, has come with unintended consequences for U.S. manufacturers. Automakers in the U.S. that were already struggling with higher input costs are now facing compounded difficulties. GM, for example, saw a direct impact from the tariffs, which contributed to its significant loss in Q2 2025. Likewise, Stellantis, another major U.S. automaker, reported a $2.7 billion loss in the first half of the year, pointing to rising prices on steel, aluminum and other components that are being hit by tariffs multiple times as they cross the US-Canada-Mexico border. The supply chains that were built under the USMCA, the trade agreement that Trump himself had renegotiated, are now becoming increasingly unworkable due to his own tariffs. The damage extends beyond the auto sector. Steel prices in the US have risen by as much as 30% since March, according to the American Iron and Steel Institute. For automakers, this has translated into an added $2,000 to $4,700 in production costs per vehicle. To mitigate these increased costs, companies have offered limited-time employee pricing incentives, but those savings are nowhere near enough to offset the billion-dollar losses that many of them are now facing. Beyond the immediate impact on manufacturers, economists from the Congressional Budget Office have warned that rising production costs in the auto sector could lead to higher overall consumer inflation in the second half of 2025. This suggests that the repercussions of the tariff policy will not be confined to the business world. Average consumers may soon feel the effects as well, particularly as the price of goods begins to rise. In this climate of rising uncertainty, Canada has positioned itself as a key player in the global trade arena. While U.S. companies struggle with shifting supply chains, Canada's new industrial capacities, fueled by government support and strategic investment, are already making waves in international markets. With Canada working to increase its exports to Asia and Europe, the shift from reliance on the U.S. to a more diversified trade network is becoming more pronounced. For the U.S., the situation raises a critical question. Is the tariff strategy undermining its own industrial base while failing to deliver the promised benefits? While Canada moves forward with a sense of economic confidence, U.S. businesses, especially in manufacturing, are being left to contend with the fallout from an unpredictable and volatile trade policy. And the worst may be yet to come as trade relations between the two neighbors continue to unravel under the weight of tariff pressures. As the trade standoff with Canada intensifies, the broader impact on U.S. global trade policy is becoming increasingly apparent. What began as a strategic move to force better deals from America's trading partners is now becoming a cautionary tale of unpredictability and rising costs. President Trump's tariff agenda was initially pitched as a tool to level the playing field for American workers and manufacturers. However, it has had the opposite effect, stifling economic growth and raising doubts about the long-term viability of such an approach. One of the most glaring issues with Trump's tariffs is the sheer inconsistency in how they are applied. The tariffs, ranging from 15% to 50%, vary significantly depending on the country and the political climate. For example, Japan and the UK recently agreed to 15% tariff deals, while Canada, the U.S. largest trading partner, faces tariffs that could climb as high as 50%. This lack of consistency has created an environment of uncertainty for businesses in the U.S., where it is difficult to predict what the rules will be from one quarter to the next. As a result, companies have been left in limbo, unsure of how to navigate the complex and shifting trade landscape. For American manufacturers, the consequences of these inconsistent policies are far-reaching. Automakers in particular are bearing the brunt of the rising costs caused by tariffs. The U.S. steel industry has seen prices skyrocket, driving up production costs for vehicles. At the same time, the disruption of supply chains that rely on cross-border trade between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico has created bottlenecks and inefficiencies. The result is a significant increase in the price of goods, especially cars, which are now more expensive to produce and purchase. While the tariffs were initially meant to protect American jobs and bring manufacturing back to the U.S., the reality is that they have had the opposite effect. U.S. companies are being squeezed by higher input costs and a lack of predictability in the trade environment. In fact, the rising costs of production have led some companies to pull back on their growth projections, with Wall Street adjusting its expectations downward for the full year. What was once seen as a strategic move to boost American manufacturing now appears to be a major obstacle to growth and stability in the U.S. economy. This economic turbulence is compounded by inflationary pressures that are beginning to ripple across the consumer market. With prices rising for steel, aluminum, and other essential components, the cost of everyday goods is expected to climb as well. As the auto industry struggles to cope with higher input costs, the broader economy could feel the effects of this inflation, potentially pushing up consumer prices in the second half of 2025. The economic fallout of Trump's tariff policies has become so pronounced that even his own allies are questioning the effectiveness of the strategy. The once strong American manufacturing sector is now facing major setbacks as companies grapple with the unpredictability of trade relationships and the rising costs of production. Despite the president's assurances that tariffs would bring jobs back to America, the reality on the ground paints a different picture. Meanwhile, Canada has positioned itself to benefit from this chaos. As the U.S. pushes ahead with its tariffs, Canada is quietly strengthening its economy by reducing its reliance on American imports and forging new trade relationships with countries in Asia and Europe. Prime Minister Mark Carney's efforts to pivot towards these new markets are already paying off, with Canadian exports in sectors like steel and uranium surging. This shift has not only helped Canada mitigate the impact of the tariffs, but it has also allowed the country to enhance its leverage in global trade negotiations. In the U.S., however, businesses are caught in a cycle of rising costs and uncertainty. For American manufacturers, this lack of clarity about trade policies is damaging their ability to plan for the future. The absence of a stable and predictable trade framework is forcing companies to divert resources away from long-term growth initiatives and toward short-term survival tactics. In this climate, the promise of returning to the golden age of American manufacturing seems increasingly elusive. Ultimately, the inconsistent application of tariffs has revealed a deeper flaw in Trump's economic strategy. What was intended to be a method for reasserting American dominance in global trade is instead exposing the fragility of the country's economic position. As Canada and other nations explore alternative trade routes and diversify their supply chains, the U.S. risks being left behind. The reality of the trade war is that it is not just alienating allies like Canada, it is also hurting the American economy in ways that were never anticipated. Canada's strategic repositioning and the global shift. As President Trump presses forward with his aggressive tariff policies, the broader geopolitical ramifications are becoming increasingly clear. While the immediate impact on U.S. businesses has been severe, Canada's response to the trade war is emblematic of a larger, more strategic shift. By leveraging its industrial and energy resources, Canada is not just weathering the storm of tariffs, it is repositioning itself as a key player in the global economy. This response, which includes redirecting trade away from the U.S. and strengthening ties with Asia and Europe, has already begun to pay dividends, creating new opportunities for Canadian industries while exposing the limitations of Trump's approach. Canada's industrial strategy, spearheaded by Premier Doug Ford in Ontario and supported by Prime Minister Mark Carney, has focused on reducing reliance on U.S. steel and aluminum. By rebuilding domestic production capacity and investing heavily in manufacturing infrastructure, Canada is moving quickly to reassert itself as a more self-sufficient economy. This isn't just a defensive response to U.S. tariffs, it's a deliberate pivot aimed at enhancing Canada's economic resilience and diversifying its trade relationships. The results of these efforts are already becoming apparent. Canada is increasingly redirecting its steel exports to Europe and Asia, while simultaneously focusing on strengthening its domestic auto production. By avoiding U.S. markets, Canada is bypassing the tariff wall Trump has constructed, opening up new opportunities in regions where demand for Canadian steel and aluminum is growing. This shift has already had a profound effect on global trade, as Canadian producers have become more competitive in international markets. While U.S. manufacturers are struggling with rising costs, Canadian companies are finding new avenues for growth, with less reliance on American buyers. At the same time, Canada is utilizing its energy resources as a critical lever in its negotiations with the U.S. Uranium, a key component of nuclear energy, has become a particularly important asset in the ongoing trade dispute. The Cigar Lake mine in Saskatchewan, one of the largest sources of uranium in the world, has supplied the U.S. with a significant portion of its nuclear fuel. As global demand for clean energy sources rises, particularly from tech giants like Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, Canada's uranium reserves are becoming even more valuable. The U.S., which now imports over 95% of its uranium, is highly dependent on Canadian supplies for its nuclear energy needs. This dynamic has added a new layer of leverage for Canada in its trade negotiations with the U.S. Despite Trump's aggressive tariff stance, Canada has found itself in a position of strength, one where its energy resources, including uranium, oil, and natural gas, are in high demand globally. As the U.S. has become more reliant on foreign energy imports, Canada is using its vast natural resources as a bargaining chip, not just to secure favorable trade deals, but to strategically shift its economic focus away from the U.S. and toward more reliable partners. In addition to uranium, Canada is also seeing increased demand for its other critical exports, such as nickel, aluminum, and oil. With its vast reserves of high-grade nickel, Ontario has become a key supplier for electric vehicle manufacturers and defense industries, both of which require substantial quantities of the metal. As the world increasingly turns to electric vehicles and green technologies, Canada's natural resource wealth is positioning the country as an essential player in the global economy. This has allowed Canada to diversify its trade relationships, reducing its dependence on U.S. markets, while increasing its influence in global supply chains. The shift in Canada's trade policy is not just economic, it is also geopolitical. As the U.S. focuses inward, building walls in the form of tariffs and trade restrictions, other nations are building bridges. China, once hesitant, has become more assertive on the world stage, responding to U.S. tariffs with retaliatory measures of its own. In April, Beijing imposed tariffs of up to 84% on U.S. goods, and it has continued to expand its Belt and Road Initiative, pledging over $1 trillion in investments across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Meanwhile, countries like Japan and South Korea are seeking trade deals with Canada, bypassing Washington entirely. The U.S., once the dominant global economic power, is now facing a shifting balance of power, with former allies and competitors alike turning to alternative partners for trade and cooperation. Canada's response to this global shift has been both pragmatic and strategic. As U.S. companies grapple with the uncertainty of Trump's tariffs, Canada is quietly building new energy corridors to Asia and Europe. By diversifying its energy exports, such as liquefied natural gas (LNG), Canada is reducing its reliance on U.S. markets and positioning itself as a key energy supplier to Asia. In July 2025, Canada shipped its first LNG cargo to South Korea from the LG Canada terminal in British Columbia, marking a significant step in its efforts to build new trade routes. With additional LNG projects like Cedar LNG and Woodfibre LNG in development, Canada is making strides to establish itself as a reliable energy partner for nations outside the U.S. sphere of influence. While the U.S. continues to focus on tariffs and trade wars, Canada is quietly reshaping its economic future. The diversification of its energy and industrial exports, coupled with a strategic shift in trade relationships, has allowed Canada to reduce its vulnerability to U.S. tariffs and trade policies. This transformation is not just about economic survival. It is about leveraging its natural resources and industrial capacity to secure a stronger position in the global market. By shifting its focus away from the U.S. and toward new partners, Canada is ensuring its long-term economic stability and enhancing its geopolitical influence. In contrast, the U.S. is facing a new reality. While Trump's tariffs may have been designed to strengthen American manufacturing and protect American jobs, they have instead exposed the fragility of the U.S. economy. The rise in production costs, disruptions to supply chains, and strained trade relationships have left many U.S. companies struggling to adjust. The once promising strategy of economic isolationism is now being questioned, as the very industries it was meant to protect are suffering the most. Meanwhile, Canada's strategic repositioning is a reminder that in the modern global economy, power does not come from isolation. It comes from being a reliable and essential partner in the interconnected web of international trade. As the U.S. continues to face the consequences of its trade policies, Canada is finding new opportunities to thrive. The shift from reliance on U.S. trade to a more diversified economic strategy has not only strengthened Canada's industrial base, but has also positioned the country as a crucial player in the global energy and manufacturing markets. While the U.S. remains